Hi, everybody. Welcome back to our class for Wednesday, October 14th, and this is for English 229. If you remember, on Monday, we did not have class, so we are picking up where we left off last week, and we were talking about the strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this novella by Robert Louis Stevenson, I think, is in some ways very much like a short story, in that there are lots of deliberate choices that are made in terms of language and symbolism. Which you oftentimes find more readily apparent in a short story than you might in, let's say, something like a novel. And it begins right with the title of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I'll begin with the idea of the strange case, that when we talk about a case, we oftentimes talk about a medical case, and certainly there is the question of medicine and medical discoveries in this text. But we also times talk about a mystery as well. And as you know, we've just finished up with Edgar Allan Poe, who's been credited with creating the modern mystery story in the way that we think of it. So this is very much a mystery that needs to be solved. That said, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde has become iconic enough so that many readers know already the answer to the mystery that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are one and the same. Though I had asked you during the attendance question, and some of you had indicated that you knew very little or perhaps even nothing about the story, so that you could be surprised as the characters themselves are surprised. And as we are introduced to a Dr. Jekyll, a doctor would be a highly respected profession. It still is today, but even more so during the Victorian period. However, we are told that he was wild in his youth, so that's a little bit of foreshadowing of what it is that we are going to be experiencing as the text progresses. Jekyll in Danish, by the way, means icicle, which I think works very nicely in relation to this particular character when we talk about the Victorian society and how repressed it was and how cold. We oftentimes talk about cold and repression in this same context. And the idea that what Dr. Jekyll is really trying to do is to kill the evil impulses within himself. He's unable to do it, and then ultimately it ends up being repressed to the point that it'll be exposed in another persona. And that happens to be Mr. Hyde. And Mr. doesn't have the same kind of status that a doctor would have. And definitely Mr. is male. And I don't know if you noticed how male-centric this particular novel is. There are very few females, which is one of the things that we are going to be talking about over the next couple of classes with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's a world of bachelors, for the most part, that we're exposed to. And this idea of hide, well, you can think about the play on words, Hide, to hide, to conceal. And obviously, Dr. Jekyll is trying to conceal his Mr. Hyde identity or his baser desires. A hide is also an animal skin, and the idea of Mr. Hyde acting very animalistic. In fact, I think I had mentioned previously that both Freud and Darwin were important theorists during this time. So we're going to get a good amount of psychology in this text, as well as a good amount of evolution, or reverse evolution, if you will, when we revisit the idea of the Mr. Hyde. In Danish, Hyde also means a haven. And I think, again, that works very nicely in terms of what we see develop over the course of the novel. We're not told very much about Mr. Hyde's appearance, but we know that he's very displeasing. It's very disorienting. He's very pale. He's dwarfish. I think it's important that he's continually referenced as being smaller than, that evil diminishes an individual, and a troglodyte at one point. Again, sort of illustrating that idea of reverse evolution, and that Hyde is becoming more of his bestial nature, and dismissing the civilizing elements of Victorian society. In fact, if you were to go through the table of contents, you could see that each of those chapter headings are very symbolic in many ways. So, for instance, there's reference in the chapter headings to doors and windows. And doors and windows are both entrances and exits to the psyche, which is exactly what we are going to be seeing with Dr. Jekyll. we are introduced to Mr. Gabriel John Utterson, and he utters or tells this particular tale, so I don't think that's a mistake. And also the idea that Gabriel has lots of Christian associations, a Christian archangel. And if you've gotten this far in your reading with Dr. Hasty Lanyon, and he is too perhaps hasty when he so quickly judges Jekyll when he finds out the true story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Eventually, he succumbs to death because he's so overcome by it. And all of this is happening on Queer Street. As you know, queer means odd, but I also looked it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, which is considered to be basically the definitive dictionary because it lists all of the words of the English language and how their usage just changed over time. So it's a huge, huge multi-volume set, or at least it was when it was in print. It no longer is. Now it's done electronically. But the first sexual reference for queer appears in the OED in the early 1900s. Now, that's not to say that the word wasn't used in a sexual context prior to the early 1900s. You'll remember that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde came out in the late 1800s. But this was the first literary, I suppose, evidence of the use of that word in that particular context, at least according to the OED. And we know that the Gothic is already filled with the idea of twos and doubles and duplicity. And that's definitely mentioned in this particular story. We're told about the house that has basically two doors, a front door and a back door. And the idea is that the front door represents the respectable elements of Victorian society. And the back door, some of the more seedy elements of Victorian society. Victorian society was a society of contrasts where they were very rich and very poor. And I think I might have mentioned this previously. It was a very sexually repressed society, but there was also a thriving prostitute trade. And in fact, that was the preferred victim for Jack the Ripper, who committed his murder shortly after this novel was published, in that he would find prostitutes in which to kill. That said, I think this novel very much shows some of the hypocrisy and the contrast that exists in society. And it's important that when we get a description of this house, we're told that it has no window, it has no bell, it has no knocker. The idea is that it is trying to isolate itself. And how many times have we talked about the idea of isolation? We can be in the middle of London and in the middle of a metropolitan area, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we can't engage in actions of isolation, which is exactly what we get with Dr. Jekyll. In fact, at one point, he tries to isolate himself from all company because he's no longer able to control his transformations. So in addition to the extreme contrast of wealth and poverty, we get the two personas of Dr. Jekyll, who is supposed to represent goodness, and the Mr. Hyde, who is supposed to represent evil, and that we each have dual natures, and that it's really impossible to split our natures into two. We are a combination rather of one or the other. But since we're told that Dr. Jekyll had a wild youth, we know that as good as Dr. Jekyll is, he had elements of evil within him, or else he never would have been tempted to make a Mr. Hyde. I don't know if Mr. Hyde has any elements of good within him, but we will revisit this idea when we start talking about Freud's theories of personality next class, with the id, which happens to be the base animalistic nature, the superego, which happens to be the conscience. So you could think of the id as a kind of Mr. Hyde, and you could think of the superego as a kind of Dr. Jekyll. And unfortunately, there is no ego, the way that Freud would call it, a balancing between the two, which could be one of the morals of this particular text. There's lots of different ways we could read this text, that it could be viewed as a condemnation of the hypocrisy and the repression of Victorian society, and that this is the result. Or it could be viewed in the exact opposite way, that this is a way to reinforce some of the morals and lessons that Dr. Jekyll struggles with when he becomes a Mr. Hyde. And we'll talk about that as well next class. If you've gotten far enough, you might have even noticed that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde have two different handwritings. They just slope in different directions. Again, the idea of good and evil, and this idea of trying to forge a signature. Because basically what we get with a Dr. Jekyll is he's trying to forge his persona. Dr. Lanyon, who, if you'll remember, Hasty Lanyon, he judged Jekyll to the point where he was so overcome that he could no longer maintain any kind of friendship with him, and then eventually succumbed to illness and died over all of the horrors. He writes a letter to Utterson, and Utterson opens that letter, and there's an interior letter. Notice again this idea of doubling, and that's supposed to be opened upon Jekyll's death or disappearance. And after we find out that Dr. Jekyll dies, he has left a narrative also to Utterson. So Utterson now has two narratives. Again, that idea of doubling throughout. At the very beginning of the novel, I think there's something that's quite telling about Victorian society when we know that Mr. Hyde has engaged in an act of violence. He's trampled a little girl. And the response from the community is that killing him was out of the question. So they threatened Hyde with scandal. And that says two things. Their first impulse would be murder, but of course, society would not allow that, civilized society. And secondly, that they knew the best way to destroy an individual was through scandal. The importance of Victorian society to be able to maintain one's reputation. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why Dr. Jekyll feels the necessity to create a Mr. Hyde. Now, that said, Utterson, one would think, would be the exact opposite of the Dr. Jekyll and should be a character that we should admire. But might I suggest that he doesn't come off as terribly attractive either. Even though he doesn't necessarily succumb to his evil desires, this bachelor lawyer, and this is a quote, was never lighted by a smile, unquote. He avoided the enjoyment of theaters and vintages. The idea that one shouldn't have pleasure for the sake of pleasure, vintages being vintage wine. There's also associations with wealth associated with that. So instead he drank gin instead of what he really wanted to drink, vintage wine. And he would retire gratefully to bed after he would read his books of divinity. Again, his life sounds rather tired and rather dire, in need of some sort of excitement. Perhaps that's the reason why he is able to keep company with individuals of somewhat questionable repute, which again makes us wonder just how good Utterson is when he deprives himself so much, but he still has connections with the people like Dr. Jekyll, who would ultimately become Mr. Hyde. Utterson also walks dutifully with Mr. Enfield. Even though he doesn't enjoy that, Mr. Enfield is one of his distant kinsmen. They do that. But as I had indicated, we do know that Utterson has a tolerance for others, and that means that Utterson is at least in the circles of individuals who might be breaking from the requirements of Victorian society, and that's our Victorian polite society. In fact, even Enfield at one point, when he's being questioned about the residence of what we find out is both Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Enfield says that he doesn't want to ask too many probing questions because he has a delicacy about him that, of course, in proper civilized society, one wouldn't push too much and do something that would be considered to be inappropriate. Now, in terms of the novel, perhaps one of the more interesting things of the novel is that we aren't, or novella, is that we really aren't given details about the actions of Mr. Hyde. We know he tramples a little girl, and trampling can be seen and is an act of violence. And one can say, too, the idea of trying to trample over something, the idea that he's trying to repress his own inner nature, perhaps is illustrated with his trampling of the little girl, who represents innocence. That's one of the reasons why it's so horrific. As many of you had indicated with Pose the Black Cat, it's the cat and the animal that oftentimes evokes more empathy from the reader because animals are innocents and so are children. And this occurs on a black winter morning, again, setting the typical Gothic mood that we would expect. And then eventually there's a murder of Sir Danvers Carey. And we aren't told much about this individual, but we do know that he has the title of Sir. So this is somebody who would be even superior to doctor. A doctor would get his title through basically education and through labor, while a Sir would get their title through birthright. We know that he was attacked with ape-like fury. Again, this Darwinian reference to reverse evolution, where we return back to our animalistic natures. But we don't know why Sir Danvers Carey was murdered, and we don't know why Dr. Jekyll, when he's in the persona of Mr. Hyde, creates such a uneasy feeling towards individuals. They just know that there's something that's not quite right about him. Now, the movies, as I had referenced earlier, will oftentimes supply lots of characters and plot that don't exist in the actual text itself. And one of the things I'm going to talk about next class are some of the themes that the text is examining. But I wanted to go back to the Fredric March film that I had asked you to watch last class. And I indicated that there are multiple versions of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and none of them have the kind of iconic status that perhaps a Frankenstein does with a Boris Karloff, but that the Fredric March 1931 version is oftentimes considered the definitive version. But that version is very, very different than the textual version that we have. So I thought I could, for today's attendance question, ask you to sort of consider that why do you think the Fredric March's Jekyll and Hyde version deviates so much from the Stevenson text? And I'll be curious to see what some of your observations are about the way it deviates and why it might deviate, which is where I'm going to pick up tomorrow when I start talking about not only where I continue talking about, or our next class, I should say, not tomorrow, where I continue talking about some of the repressive natures of Victorian society, some of Stevenson's commentary about the psyche, and some of the sexual readings that have been done with this particular text, again, because the Victorian period was known for its highly repressive nature. So I hope you are well. I am well. I am looking forward to your comments about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And I'm in the midst of grading journals and returning back journals. So I hope you've received some feedback from me. And certainly if you handed in a journal for the first writing assignment or for our first reading assignment and you haven't received it back yet and you submitted it in on time or shortly thereafter, I should have returned it back to you. So if you haven't received it, please let me know. And I'm in the middle now of sort of grading the journals that I would have received last week from midweek on. So those should be coming to you very shortly. So take care. I hope you're well. And we will continue on next class with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.